Well, against my better judgment, I think I'm going to wade into the current HBD controversy that is swirling around Bronze Age Pervert. He goes by Bronze Age Mantis on Twitter. He's the author of Bronze Age Mindset and many other writings. I'll say from the outset, I'm not a fan of Bronze Age Pervert. I couldn't get through his book because I found it so annoying and shallow. That is the Bronze Age Mindset book. It's very depressing that he is associated with Nietzscheanism. He presents Nietzsche in a way that could only be described as teenage or juvenile, but the rest of his output seems to be filled with various bold assertions, bravery signaling, his announcement that he is the biggest badass ever, while he's actually kind of hiding away in Romania, and he kind of looks like a weirdo, to be honest. But I actually will wade into this because I find myself agreeing with him, at least on a superficial level, about the limitations of HBD. And here I'm speaking personally, not necessarily what his perspective is, but also some annoyance I have with some of these late coming adopters of HBD. I'm thinking here specifically of Aporia magazine and Bo Weingard, but there are probably other examples. Anyway, let me read this one tweet because it will give me enough fodder to dilate on this matter. So this is Bronze Age Pervert, January 2nd, 2024. While for the sake of truth, I think facts about racial disparities should be discussed, it's not good at all politically. Well, fair enough. I basically agree. In 2024, going into any sort of political debate with a bunch of IQ charts or calipers or anything resembling that would just be a total non-starter. You'll get lambasted in the press, you'll be canceled, etc., etc. But we already knew that. I would ask whether posting homoerotic photos on Instagram declaring yourself a barbarian Nietzschean while ultimately being curiously Jewish is a good path forward politically. I'm not sure race realism is worse than that one, but I guess we should just take him at his word that he knows better. But anyway, I'll read on. In fact, it's impossible in the present circumstances. Only a myth of race blindness is workable. Well, again, I do tend to agree on a superficial level. I also agree on a deeper level of a myth of race blindness. I think it is a myth, and that is the best way to think about it. He drops that later on in this, but I would applaud him for understanding that it is ultimately about feelings and not facts. Feelings don't care about your facts. You could have all the facts in the world, enough to fill up many volumes by Richard Lynn, and that myth of race blindness, this idea that we can overcome the past, evolution, tribe, etc., is extremely powerful. The notion that every human person has the ability, whether it derives from his immortal soul or his mind in a kind of Hegelian way, that he can overcome all of this. He can overcome his upbringing. He can overcome his tendency to side with his tribe. He can overcome his evolutionary past. He can overcome the history of colonialism or the oppression, the Holocaust, Jim Crow, et cetera, et cetera. There is a kind of mythical, idealistic impulse that derives the tenets of liberalism. And I totally agree with that. And I think in the face of something that powerful, race realism will ultimately fall flat. And I do think that that's its fatal flaw. I also agree that the truth is the truth. You should read the data, use your logic and sometimes intuitive leaps, but you should just pursue the truth wherever it takes you. And even if it is politically unpalatable for most, that's okay. That's not your job. So I more or less agree with him here, even if he is acting in bad faith as usual. You won't convince some populations that they are inferior by birth and deserve their station in life. You won't even convince, quote, decent people, end quote, from high-achieving populations of this. I don't know why he used a scare quote there, but I'll move on. On the other hand, discrimination to offset perceived past discrimination or natural inequalities is also felt to be wrong, although I think it would be relatively easy to convince modern populations to accept affirmative action to offset natural inequalities, which is another reason pushing this with a political intention is a big mistake. Okay. This isn't exactly clear, but I know what he's talking about, and he actually does clarify this in some other tweets. And I think this gets to an important aspect of why I also think race realism is rather unworkable and not really worth pursuing, certainly politically, but also intellectually. It's a dead end, as it were. So there's a fact and value problem here. So there's the fact that Johnny can't read good, that Johnny has a low IQ, that Johnny got hit in the head by a mule when he was 5, that Johnny's father was in and out of prison for his entire life, et cetera, et cetera. There's also a value that we want Johnny to be good. We want Johnny to overcome those things. We want Johnny to transcend his past. Those are just two very different things. Race realism is, or has been, very often associated with white nationalism. Much in the way, and pardon the controversial analogy I'm going to draw, much in the way that, say, Holocaust denial has been hand in glove with neo-Nazism or some sort of right-wing ideology. So I'll take the latter salacious example to prove the point, which is that theoretically you could, of course, find someone who examines the history books, examines the archives, delves into the Auschwitz camp, etc. And they are a liberal. They're a leftist. They're a communist, let's say, and they just determine that the Holocaust didn't happen. That is theoretically possible, of course, but it never really happens that way, does it? Most all Holocaust revisionists are right-wingers. It just is what it is. They are self-serving in their history writing. Now, everyone's self-serving, of course, but they are particularly self-serving. And they want it to be true. They want to rescue the reputation of Hitler, etc. Now, that's a very strong example to prove a point, but you see where I'm going with race realism. Now, theoretically, you can go in with an open mind, just look at the facts, use evolutionary theory to reach race realism, and that doesn't have anything to do with what you feel or what your values might be. You could be a Catholic, you could be a communist, you could be an atheist, libertarian, etc. But let's just be real here. It might not be as strong as the Holocaust revision example that I mentioned, but most all race realists are in effect white nationalists. Now, what is white nationalism? I think it probably could be defined as the idea that the American white population needs to be segregated from other races and needs a state of its own. Now, it can take a lot of other forms. That's a good definition. And those people are very much into the psychometric discussion, that is the IQ discussion, evolutionary theory about races, etc. Now, that's not always the case. Many people who were clearly white nationalists were Christians who rejected Darwin, etc., but that's the case now. So I'm thinking here something like American Renaissance, Videre, etc. They are, in effect, Republicans, but they're Republicans with a little bit extra. They are Republicans who bring their data tables to the party and don't just engage in dog whistling, let's say. So those people are naturally inclined to like HBD, and HBD reinforces many of their pre-existing presuppositions. So it says that white people are smarter than blacks, not quite as smart as Asians, at least on math, and not nearly as smart as Ashkenazi Jews. So it reinforces presuppositions. It makes them feel good, to be frank. Now, this can take a number of different forms. I have definitely known some libertarians, some even anarchist types, who think that race realism is necessary precisely because there are going to be group inequalities in any free society. And if you find that a, say, law school class is predominantly white, Asian, and Ashkenazi Jewish, and blacks are well underrepresented and Hispanics are fairly underrepresented, then you could say, well, the admissions officers, they must be racist. There must be some systematic racism that's infected our entire society. We have to look into this. We need to counteract it with public measures. And then one public measure follows another, becoming more and more intense. It leads to more socialism, et cetera, et cetera. There's this big problem that you think is a problem because you aren't ultimately colorblind. No one is colorblind. Everyone can read a stoplight. So if your presupposition is that this should be a random distribution in this hypothetical law school class, then you're going to want to solve that problem. Well, another solution is that it's just about race realism, Asians, high spatial mathematical IQ, lower on the verbal. They can do the law school stuff. Ashkenazi, super good at verbal. No doubt that they're vastly overrepresented. Whites, well-rounded population, and there's no question of why they're overrepresented or just simply represented. Hispanics, that's a very diverse population, but certainly with African Americans, they're just not up to the task. Some individuals will be, but when we're looking at this thing on a demographic level, they're just going to be seriously underrepresented. And that just is what it is. And we need not judge anyone. That African American who gets into law school is just as talented as the Asian candidate. And we can speak, break bread, exchange ideas as individuals in that type of realm if it is truly free. And in this scenario, race realism bolsters that type of free society. Well, I don't think the world really works that way. The world works in a way that is driven by, on the one hand, a sort of racial nationalism, which is actually a very natural thing, and on the other hand, a sort of, let's say, Christian idealism. There's no Greek, there's no white, there's no Jew, there's only one in Christ, or one in America, or one under the law, etc. It's a kind of post-Christian conception. And both of those things are going to counteract any sort of free society. So the post-Christian one is pretty obvious. You see a law school class, or let's say you see the current class of the University of California, Los Angeles, and it's all Asian, and it just feels a little gross. It feels unfair. It's bad. Something must be done, etc. Now, I don't think we should underestimate the power of white nationalism, even in the United States. So if you look at expressed preferences of the U.S. population, it is basically a kind of socially conservative, fiscally liberal grouping. I can remember growing up in the 90s and hearing a lot about this new type of person who was fiscally conservative and socially liberal. So what that means is he accepted gays, women in the workplace, just fine. But, we can't tax too hard and we got to balance those budgets, etc. That person barely exists. There are actually very few people who hold that perspective. Whereas there is a huge swath of the population that want their health care, they want their social security, they want their guaranteed union labor job, etc. But what they don't want is transsexuals, women being too nasty, I guess is the word from the Trump era. They want their patriotism, they want their flag waving, they want their NFL football, and their apple pie. It goes on and on. You know what I'm talking about. That is the median voter. And so white nationalism plays a role in politics right now. It's wrong to say that it is, it's irrelevant or it's unpolitical or it's just downright stupid not to play to that. That's actually a very powerful motive. This social conservatism. And in a way, it often just resembles white nationalism. It is pro-patriotism, pro-Christianity to a large degree, maybe a little bit less so now, but I'm not even sure about that. And it's pro-us. We don't like the immigrants. They're going to take our jobs, etc. In addition to that, white nationalism has played a very important role in Republican politicking after realignment, which occurred, I guess, in the late 60s, was cemented by 1994 with the Republican Revolution, etc. And it's also known as the Southern Strategy. We see this with Nixon. We certainly saw it earlier with Goldwater, going hunting where the ducks are. That is, if you're a libertarian pro-war candidate like Goldwater was, why try to convince people who don't want to hear that? Why not go to the South and win the Deep South on that message? I'm against the Civil Rights Act, period. And I'm also pro-flag, yes, ma'am, get some more apple pie up in this bitch. That is going to play really well in the South. That is the Southern strategy, effectively. All of these white Southern Democrats across generations moved off that party. And beginning with Goldwater, definitely with Nixon, there's some murkiness in there. Jimmy Carter was the first evangelical Christian president, etc. But by the Reagan era and into the 90s, these white Southern conservatives moved off the Democratic Party and they became firm Republicans. And what's interesting is that from what I can tell, kind of looking back at my own career and looking at history, I think that race realism, that is, people like Jared Taylor or Charles Murray, although, those are different types of people, but, tons of similarities. That these types of people and the whole HBD motive was a kind of rationalization or explication of the Southern strategy, which probably was the most successful political strategy of my lifetime, maybe of the last 75 years. So what I mean by that is that, there's a famous line from Atwater where he said, at one point you could go yell the N-word. He actually used the N-word when he said this. He's like, you could just yell N-word, N-word, N-word. Then you had to be a little more subtle about it. You had to say, well, we're against forced busing or too much integration, et cetera. And then you can't even talk about that. You've got to talk about, well, we're for Reaganomics and tax cuts and stuff like that. But the underlying message remained. That is winning over whites to the Republican Party effectively on the basis of racism. And as I look back, on my life, I see a lot of this white nationalism as being, in effect, a kind of like idea factory or intensification or, again, explication of what is a implicit political strategy. The Southern strategy, the most successful political strategy of the last 75 years, also the most subtle and the most implicit, tacit. It's what you don't say that gives it its pop. You don't just go out there and yell the N-word. You imply that the Republican Party is the home to whites. And you also imply that a certain kind of race blindness is in effect good for whites. And I think that might very well be true in many cases. You see this even today in a lot of the Ron DeSantis stuff or the critical race theory outrage. That was all very, very silly. Critical race theory is not being taught in lower school. It's barely being taught in graduate school, to be honest. Anyway, but we know what they're talking about. They're talking about the whole left in general. They're talking about a kind of anti-white animus that is motivating these institutions, animating these institutions. And if we could just get away from race, everything would be fine. And it's almost as if they think reverse racism is almost kind of worse than the good old-fashioned white racism. I don't know. So these things have been very powerful, and HBD is not a fringe thing. It is in a way, but it's actually highly integrated with Republican electioneering. And it still is. And it probably will be for another decade or two. But these people like to say that they hate the Republican Party and they are post-political, they just care about the white race or whatever. I am skeptical of that, and I find that they are all, at the end of the day, fans of the Republican Party. They just say the quiet part out loud, and they probably say it too loudly, maybe for comfort. But that is what they are doing. They aren't actually finding a third way or a new path. It isn't ultimately about, Western civilization or the white race. It's kind of, at the end of the day, an intellectual hotbox for justifying the Republican Party. Okay. Let me read on here, and I'll probably, go on some more digressions, but I hope this is interesting. This is Bronze Age pervert again. The only solution in the short run is race blindness, stopping and reversing all racialization of politics and society. This isn't my preference, because he's such a badass, by the way, but a statement of fact. The HBD position is an impossibility politically and culturally today. Again, I've already said I basically agree with that. Public hypocrisy is the only way out that will be accepted unless you are ready to go the Nietzsche and Gobineau route, and you are not. All right, so this is some of his bravery signaling. My only question to BAP would be, are you ready to go the Nietzsche and Gobineau route? Because I don't really see that reading this. It kind of seems like you're cautiously advising conservatives not to talk about human biodiversity too much. So what is the point? Like, why would you be giving this advice if you are already a Ubermensch of some kind? It's rather odd. But anyway, there's another aspect of this that I think is worth talking about, and that is the Aporia magazine, which is on Substack, and I've read some things from them. Seems good. I haven't interacted with him in a while, but I used to interact with Bo Weingard quite a bit on Twitter, and it's he seems like a good guy. I have very little interest in this subject at this point in time because I feel like everything that could conceivably be said has been said. I mean, there's a famous story of someone who worked at the patent office in Washington, D.C., and he said, well, we might need to close this down because everything that could be invented already has been, and that was in 1905 or something. I mean, it's probably apocryphal, but you kind of know the type of person who would say that, or you see the fallacy right there. He said that just before the revolution and the computer and automotives and robotics and et cetera, et cetera. He just couldn't see it because he was thinking in the past. And all the past inventions, yes, have already been invented, but that just shows that he has a lack of imagination. But I do think that this is, in fact, true when it comes to HBD. I don't think that there's much more that really needs to be done on this subject. And it seems like people pursuing it are circling the drain around things that have already been established, but they're presenting themselves as having these bold new ideas. I'm just looking at an article here written by Bo Weingard, The Case for Race Realism. Race is real and consequential. That actually seems to be a kind of synopsis of an article that I wrote about 10 years ago now, with basically the same subtitle. I remember saying, race is real, race matters, and race is the foundation of identity. Race is real and consequential. Yeah, I mean, all of this stuff has been done. And even when I did it, it was old. I'm not claiming that I'm some pioneer in this subject. I'm definitely not. But it's presented as if, I'm here telling you people what you finally need to recognize. And it's just this rehash of things that are rather tired at this point. I don't know what to say, but they're just reinventing all of these things that have been done before while conspicuously not giving people credit. I actually published a book, and I worked quite diligently on it. It's written by Ed Dudden. I added a lot to it. I'm, not to take anything away from Ed. It's definitely his book, but as editor, I really added a lot to it in structuring it and so on. I commissioned it. It's called Making Sense of Race. It's worth reading. But even while doing it, I was kind of over it. I knew all of this stuff, and it was, presented extremely well by Ed. It's refined, it's updated, but it's really the same fundamental principles. And I don't know, maybe I'm just missing something, but I don't know where this goes from here. And I think it is rather odd, although maybe it's not really that odd, of conservatives now adopting it now that it's in itself fairly inconsequential. The sense that conservatives are, by their very nature, this backward-looking group of people. And I remember thinking this with the rise of Ann Coulter in the Trump movement. Now, she'd had a career for 20 years, but she really became something with Trump. She was the ultimate Trump fan, and she just sounded exactly like stuff that I'd read in VDare in circa 2003. If we don't elect Trump, we don't stop immigration now, nothing matters, we won't have a country, or at least we won't recognize it, and blah, 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 blah. All of that stuff had been said. All of that was just talking points from yesteryear. And as I pointed out in a speech I gave at American Renaissance in 2011, I think, well, it might have been late. It was 2013, but I was referring to data from 2011. The majority of births in the United States are to non-white mothers. Thus, the demographic transition is baked into the cake. There's not much you can really do outside of, I guess, going the full Gobineau or, I don't know. It's weird to associate Nietzsche with this stuff. But anyway, it's baked in the cake. You just have to deal with it. And I actually tried to deal with it in the speech I gave. But it's very odd that people like Ann Coulter adopt all of these things kind of like 20 years after they're no longer relevant. And maybe I keep saying it's odd. It's not odd. It's what conservatives always do. They quest after a lost cause. The moment something is irrelevant or backwards is the moment they start loving it, because due to their personalities. They're not on the vanguard of anything. That's antithetical to who they are. So they adopt the vanguard 30 years too late. Conservatives oppose MLK and race blindness and the civil rights stuff. And then 20 years on, we love it. That we invented it, in fact. This is what we're all about. They're just an unbearable group of people, in my opinion, conservative intellectuals. And, again, I like Bo Weingard. I've never met him personally, just interacted with him a bit, and I've read him here intellectually. I mean, I like him. He seems like a great guy. And I'm sure all of his stuff is well written and well done. But it's just rehashing things that people did previously, and to be honest, not giving them credit for cutting the path. And that is rather intellectually dishonest. Why does this thing exist? You've just invented race realism. This has been going on for decades. Anyway, I won't dwell more on that. Let me try to wrap this up, because I've spoken for over 30 minutes in a rather rambling but hopefully enlightening way. So let's go back to facts and values. Race realism is purely about facts at its best. Maybe it's self-serving, but it's ultimately about getting at the hard truth, no matter what it is. Whereas values define society. So, thus, you could be a race realist. You could think that race differences are evolutionarily developed. They're pretty hard. You can't change them too much with education or society, etc., and come to conclusions that would infuriate every single race realist. For example, you could say that, yes, Hispanics have a lower IQ than whites on average, And thus, we need much more immigration because we're moving to a service or retail-based society or economy, and we need those 90 IQ people to, sell us the products or park our cars, etc. You could easily make that argument. You could also say that, yes, it's true. It's not just the history of slavery. It's actually evolution and their ancestral environment that makes African Americans less intelligent on average. And thus, we need to dedicate more resources to raising blacks up. We need to dedicate more resources towards affirmative action. Because, they're not quite as good at tests and other things, and maybe they're not as smart to the degree to which that can be measured. But we want a society that reflects our dreams, and thus we will force it to be if we have to. So, yes, race realism is a kind of double-edged sword. It could easily support libertarianism, it could easily support white nationalism, it could support conservatism, but it also could be used in a left-wing fashion. Now, might very well be unlikely, might not. I mean, it is what it is. My general point is that values drive society and not facts. Feelings don't care about your facts. And thus, the most important thing for anyone who wants to change society, who wants a new world that does adhere to his dreams, is to engage with culture and ideology and, dare I say it, feelings.